it's David Levin, and welcome to another episode of Pop Goes the Culture. This is one of those bittersweet episodes that I love and hate to do. This weekend we lost the great Dwayne Hickman, who of course was known as Dobie Gillis on The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, which aired in the late 50s and early 60s on CBS. He was certainly an iconic actor, a character, and co-starring with Bob Denver, who played Maynard Krebs, later went on to play Gilligan. And Dwayne had quite a varied career, and I had the chance to talk to him many years ago. He not only worked as an actor in Dobie Gillis, but he was also a TV executive at CBS, and he worked on MASH, Designing Women. He worked on Head of the Class and The Hulk. And during our conversation, we talked about his career as a TV executive. We talked about working on Dobie Gillis. We talked about the Bob Cummings show, which he was on, the first show that he starred in. He talks about Bill Bixby. He talked about practical jokes they played on Warren Beatty on Dobie Gillis, and really sorry to see him go, but really happy to present this interview. So if you like it, please subscribe to Pop Goes the Culture. We would love to see you back here, and please hit the bell so that we will let you know when we have other episodes coming up. We upload every week. Anyway, very sad to lose Dwayne Hickman, but here is my interview from many years ago with the great Dwayne Hickman.
Well, I love art. I loved it all my life, and I've always been drawing and all that. I've been painting now for about 15 years. I have shows, and I sell pretty well.
I was reading about some of this, I guess, Joan?
Yeah.
She sent me a bunch of stuff that I was looking at.
She's my kind of partner in business, and she sets up the galleries and orders the prints and the whole thing.
So is it drawing? Is it painting?
I paint oil on canvas.
Uh-huh. What kind of subjects are your favorite?
Mostly landscape. And I don't know. I see. Are we rolling?
Yes, we are.
We are. Oh, you're one of those. Oh.
Yes, I'm not trying to catch you.
No. I'm glad. No, I like to paint oil on canvas, and I like landscapes. I like structural landscapes, like houses, bridges, gardens, doorways, anything that has some structure to it. And then lately, I've been kind of branching out to just plain landscapes with flowers, fields of flowers and things. I love the yellows and reds and blues and. So I don't know. It's been a fun thing for me. I've enjoyed it.
You can lose yourself. I mean, there's certain things I know that I've done drawing and I've done music and I've also played with computers, and they're kind of they're black holes in terms of all of a sudden you look down and when you look back up, it's hours later. That's
what Tony Bennett says, and he's an artist too. He paints landscapes as well. He says it's like a Zen experience, and it's true. The problem with it is, it's a right brain thing. Meaning it's intuitive and feely, and it's just not at all like linear and so forth like the left brain. So if I've done it for a couple hours and my wife comes in and says, by the way, so-and-so called and they want you to do so-and-so, I look at her like, who's this person? You know, what is she saying to me? What is all this about? And it takes me an hour or so to get back to the real world, because you're in another world when you do it. And it's a world you love. You get addicted to it. And that's why the artist is kind of the absent-minded guy, you know, that he's been portrayed that way. So if I have to do something like I'm doing now, I kind of lay off for a couple days before doing it. So I'm kind of try to be as sharp as possible.
Right. So you've done both the left brain and the right brain thing.
Well, yeah, I'm one of the few, because a lot of artists can't do that. But I can put the art down and go and balance my checkbook and do things like that. And most artists can't. They're either one or the other. And there's really not much demand for the artist in today's society. Most of the jobs are linear, left brain, repetitive kinds of jobs, you know, accounting and finance and business. Most business is left brain. And I don't know, so I find myself kind of fluctuating between the two.
Ambidextrous, as it were.
A kind of mental ambidextrousness. No such word.
I'd give my left arm to be ambidextrous. Anyway, so,
I would too. My left hand I don't use like my right.
Let's sort of go way back early on.
Okay.
Sort of, for the moment, we'll work our way through linearly, although we may bounce around non-linearly for a little bit.
Okay.
Where did you get started in terms of?
Well, I was a child actor. My mother was an actress, and then she got my older brother, Daryl Hickman, started in movies, and then she kind of dragged me along because she needed a sitter. And all of a sudden I was in the movies, and I was a little kid. I was out at MGM, and I was people's son. I was Claudette Colbert's son in a movie called The Secret Heart. I was Jeanette MacDonald's son in a movie called The Sun Comes Up. I was around, and then later I did things like Boy with Green Hair with Dean Stockwell. So I just kind of grew up in the business, and then kind of got out of it when I went to high school.
So how did Bob Cummings come along?
Well, I was going to high school, and then I went into college, and an agent called that I hadn't talked to in ages, and he said, "Do you want to go out and interview for a pilot for a Bob Cummings show?" And I said, "No, I just finished my freshman year at Loyola University. I want to just kind of concentrate on school," and I was thinking about becoming an architect because I was so interested in art and architecture. So he said, "Well, go see him," and I went to see him, and they called me back, and all of a sudden I got this part on the Bob Cummings show, and I had planned that summer to work for the DWP, the Department of Water and Power here in Los Angeles. So I called the guy downtown and said, "I'm sorry, I can't do the DWP job. I'm going to do a pilot for a Bob Cummings show." And he was kind of put out. But I went and did the pilot. And then I went back to school in the fall, and I was a sophomore, and then the agent called and said, "By the way, the show sold." And I said, "What show?" He said, "The Bob Cummings show." I said, "But I only worked 2 days like 3 months ago." He says, "Yeah, but it's sold and you're in the series." And that began a run of about 5 years. So all of a sudden, architecture, art, everything I was going to school and doing the Cummings show. I'd go like 1 day a week, and then makeup classes, and it was very difficult. And I did that for about 3 years. And then I kind of dropped out because I got so busy. And then later in the 60s went back and got the 3 units I needed and graduated.
What was it like going back to college after having sort of played a couple of television icons?
Well, they kind of spoon-fed me. I didn't really go to many classes. I went to the teachers, the professors, and kind of took the work and sort of did it on the side, and did some tests and things. And in fact, I even went back after I graduated to take graduate work in communications. And I had a course I was doing in the summer of about 68 or 9. And I got a movie, and I had to drop out again. So I thought, I was trying to always protect myself so I had some job I could do other than acting, because I never felt that acting was a real job. I wanted something that paid, and that's why I went to CBS in '77. I had flopped around in the late 60s. I went to Las Vegas for 2 years. I booked entertainment at the Landmark Hotel, which was a Howard Hughes hotel. And I didn't like that, and I tried advertising. I came back from that, and I did dinner theater, and then I thought, I've got to get a real job. So I went to work for CBS in '77, and I supervised shows like MASH and Designing Women, Good Times, All in the Family, shows like that. And I was kind of the liaison between the network and the show.
What was it like making that transition over to the other side?
Well, it was kind of, hard in a way, because I thought it would be easy. But first of all, I was so schooled in the artistic, the acting, that it was hard to fit into the corporate. And a place like CBS is very corporate and very, very political. And it was hard. And also, people never quite let me forget that I was Dobie, I mean, I've been Dobie for 50 years now. And, well, the show went on in '59 and went off in '63, and then has rerun ever since. So I've been Dobie Gillis for the better part of my life. And people don't quite let you forget that. And also, they didn't quite trust me. I was on the side of the producers. You know, the guys I worked for at CBS would say, now you've got to do something about this show. It's not funny enough, it's not dramatic enough, it's not this enough. Go do something about it. And I'd say, okay, let me handle it. I'd call up and I'd say, can you make the second act a little funnier? You know, I mean, a little brighter? And they'd say, oh, sure, sure. And that's how I do. I was kind of buffered in, I was in the middle all the time, trying to fend off the show producers and trying to fend off my bosses. And so it was kind of odd. And the politics, you know, I found that people got ahead by not making decisions, by sort of just, you know, kind of status quo. I mean, there was a reading once for an actor for a part in a pilot. And he read, and the guy I worked for turned to me and said, what do you think? And the guy was lousy. He was lousy. I mean, I've been an actor for my whole life, and the guy wasn't very good. And I said, well, I think he's interesting, which means nothing, of course. And the guy that I worked for turned to his boss, and he says, I think he's wonderful. We should hire him. And I said, So I went back to my office. I called my wife, and I said, you know, I've lost it. The two men I work for, the two vice presidents I work for, just loved an actor that can't do it. And I think I've lost my touch. I don't understand acting or how to do it. And she said, well, don't worry, don't worry. And I was very depressed about it. Well, they got him, and he couldn't do it. And they had to replace him. So that's kind of the way my days at CBS were. And then I left in '87 to do a Dobie Gillis reunion movie, Bring Me the Head of Dobie Gillis. So I left, and it was an experience.
What was it like going back to the other side?
I kind of liked it. I liked it. I don't like the unemployment part, and I don't like the trying to get jobs part. But I went out on things, and I started directing. I directed Designing Women and Head of the Class and some shows around town. And I kind of like that, except that was kind of hard too, because you're so responsible for all the mechanical things, the crew things, the photography things. And if you could work just with the actors, that would be great, but you can't. You've got to have it all. And most of the people that make really good directors are kind of A personalities, you know, they're take charge kind of people, and I'm kind of passive. I really like it's like my art. I love it because it's me and the canvas, and it's not a collaboration. Actors, directors, producers collaborate with one another because they have to. In other words, you get a part in a show, you work with other actors, you take direction, all that. So it's a joint project. Being an artist is a solitary, one-on-one project. It's me and the art, and my choices are all my choices. No help.
It must have been difficult for you to give notes to some of those shows, but for example, a show like MASH.
Well, it was very difficult. I tried, and by the way, I didn't give many notes. I wound up trying to fake it. You know, I'd give broad notes, and I'd be because they'd see me and think, are you going to do the show this week? And I'd say, no, I work for CBS now. And they'd say, you do? I remember Bill Bixby on The Hulk. I showed up one day. Now, I had known Bixby his first job was on Dobie Gillis. As a matter of fact, Bixby made up credits, I later found out. I saw his sheet on Dobie, and it said, you know, Shakespeare, this play, that, and all that. And they hired him, and he was terrific. He was always a very good actor, and I ran into him on The Hulk when I was at CBS, and I said, you know, Bill, years ago, you had these credits, and I was so intimidated and impressed. And he said, I made them up. I said, you made up the credits to get the job in Dobie? He says, yeah, I'd never worked. He said, I'd never worked before, so I made up the credits. And I couldn't believe it. All these years I'd been so intimidated by Bill Bixby. And then he started telling me all his problems as the star of The Hulk and what CBS ought to be doing and all that. So he forgot immediately that I was an old actor friend, but now I was the network guy that he could wail on, you know.
So what did he wail? What kind of stuff was he?
All the scripts weren't good enough. We were pushing him too hard. We didn't shoot long enough. It was, well, that kind of stuff, you know.
What do you remember about some of the shows of that period?
The ones when I was at CBS?
Sure.
Mostly they weren't as good as they could be. The shows that were the best, well, MASH is a top show. Designing Women was a very good show. Linda Bloodworth Thomason, Harry Thomason produced it, did a great job. So I was on some pretty good shows, but where the shows failed was, you know, it's like a camel is a horse designed by a committee. There's so much network input, so much interference, that you know, you start the week with a script that's not very good, and then you fix it for Tuesday, and then by Wednesday you fix it again, and then toward the end of the week when you have to film it, you've got nothing, and you've got a weak show. With Dobie, Max Schulman and a couple people, they sat and they wrote these, and you got them and you shot them, and they were better. Paul Henning, who did the Beverly Hillbillies, Bob Cummings show, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, Paul did that. He sat and wrote the show, and there were no rewrites, and there weren't 12 writers. You know, every show now has 12 writers, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
What did you take with you when you went to and when I get to the second tape, we'll devote that totally to Dobie, so we can bounce around.
It's okay. Dobie's a good subject because
I can't wait to talk about it.
Dobie was a special show. I mean, it was very ahead of its time. I mean, it was satirical. It was best thing about Dobie was it was about teenage life from the teen's point of view. And I was that teen, and it was my point of view with my friends and all that. It wasn't about the parents. It wasn't Father Knows Best. It wasn't Ozzie and Harriet. It was about the kids. And I used to sit there in front of the, you know, the thinker statue and say, you know, my name's Dobie Gillis, and I'm 17 years old, and what I want is a girl. One lousy girl. But standing between that is a powerful force. And then they'd cut to my father, Herbert T. Gillis, because I needed the money from my father to get the girl, one soft, round, creamy, dreamy girl for my very own. So it was clever, and it was well written, because Max Schulman had been an author of books, novels. He had been a playwright. He had been a short story writer. In fact, Dobie Gillis appeared in short stories in the 50s, and he was very, very clever and good. And we had Rod Amato, who had produced and directed the Cummings show, and then later Burns and Allen, and he was very gifted too, Rod, and Rod and Max worked very well together. And then we had a wonderful cast. I mean, we had, you know, Bob Denver, who's like one of a kind. I mean, I love Bob. He and I have never had a harsh word, and yet we're totally different.
How's that?
Well, he's very loose and easy and kind of hippie-ish, I suppose. I don't know. But he's very different. And I'm very conscientious, and I study it and learn it and work at it. I'm very much, and I'm, you know, khakis and crew cuts and check shirts, and he's sweatshirts and old shoes. He's a hippie, and I'm the straight kid. And we were cast that way. And funny, as different as we are, like when we did the reunion movie, I was saying, now, we've got to go shoot this over here. And he said, you really like doing this, don't you? I said, what do you mean? He says, you like making this movie. I said, oh yeah, I've worked on it for years to get it made. And he says, I can't imagine. I said, where are you going? He says, to my room, lay down, rest. And that's Bob. He's terrific.
You guys gave him a great line in that movie, which I did. See, I watched. Pay attention.
Good.
Where he said,
work.
He said, where have you been?
No.
Where have you been all these years?
No, what did he say?
It says, I've been trapped on a deserted island.
Oh, yes, the Gilligan Island.
Gilligan Island.
You know, I did the Surviving Gilligan's Island movie a couple of years ago, and I played the head of the network, which I loved because I was just a jerk. You know, I mean, I said, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my whole career. You know, I had lines like that. This show is awful, you know, Gilligan's Island. But I love Bob, and I always have, and he was terrific, and he brought an awful lot to the show, as did Sheila James, who played Zelda, and Tuesday Weld, who I had differences with, which were kind of my fault probably, a little bit of both maybe, but she was very young. She was only 14. I was 24, I think, and I was working very hard to make it perfect, and she was out dating, you know. I mean, she didn't really care that much, and so we had differences, but she was terrific. I mean, she was really just great as Thalia Mininger. And then we had Warren Beatty as Milton Armitage, the rich boy. And Warren was a piece of work. He hardly talked to anybody. I don't think he talked to Denver ever. Denver tells me that he never talked to him. He hardly talked to me. He was like, you know, handsome and big and bigger than life, and assured of stardom when he, you know, was not a star. I mean, he was just on Dobie Gillis. And he would, before a take, he'd take his comb out and look in the camera lens and comb his hair. And I looked at him doing that, and I thought, my God, where have I been? This man is like, give him enough time, he'll rule the world. And he has, and he has. He's done extremely well. So he brought a lot to the part, because he was Milton Armitage, the rich boy. And of course, we had a lot of other, my parents, Florida Freebus played my mother, Winifred Gillis, and Herbert T. Gillis was Frank Phelan, character actor from movies. He was terrific. He was really a curmudgeon. He was an Archie Bunker. I mean, he really, and I don't know, it just all kind of came together. And then the guest people we had like Bixby and Marlo Thomas and Ellen Burstyn and Michelle Lee and all these people getting their start. They were all getting started in show business because we had so many good parts for young people, my contemporaries. Funny thing, you know, I always thought I was the oldest of the crowd. You know, I always thought, because I always gave my correct age. Now that we're all older, all of us, I realize that I'm not only the same age as most of these people, but maybe a little younger than some. But anyway.
I mean, adults playing teenagers.
Well, we were, yeah. I was 24 playing 17. Everybody was, you know, Bixby I think was a little older than I was. But he was at least as old, and, you know, his bio along with the made-up credits probably shaved a few years off his age.
Well, we spoke to Sheila James when we were doing our pilot.
Well, now she's great. I mean, she's a brain. You know, she's take over the government in Sacramento. She's a state senator, and she's very bright. She was bright then. She's bright now. She went to Harvard Law School, and she's a force to be reckoned with. She really is.
Now, you've been a network executive, so you probably know the history of spinoffs, but was Zelda the first pilot spinoff?
No, I don't think so. I think that Norman Lear, of course, that's much later. Zelda might have been. Might have been. You know, we did a thing that most people don't know about when I was doing Cummings called Chuck Goes to College. And it was kind of a Dobie Gillis kind of show, and it was a spin-off of the Bob Cummings show that, had it sold, which it didn't, would have made me the star of Chuck Goes to College.
And the first spin-off.
And maybe one of the first, yeah, back that far. That was about 54, 5, 6, somewhere in there. So it could have been one of the first. Sheila's show, and I forget, it was called Zelda, that may have been one of the early ones too. I'm sorry that didn't sell for her sake. I think she's very disappointed in that.
She told us that she got an interesting code word note of why it didn't sell, which is that a network executive or the producer came to her and said they felt your character was a little too butch.
Well, yeah, she's told me that too. I've heard that, and I usually say, you know, maybe that's not it. Maybe it just didn't sell because it wasn't what they wanted or wasn't funny enough. But there is a problem, you know, in the media about gay and straight and all that. And I think that I think it's getting better. I'd like to think it's getting better because I don't have any time for it. I don't approve of it. It's not at all right. But there is a bias against people because of their sexual preferences, and I think that's very wrong. And whenever I see it or hear it, I really react very strongly against it. I think it's wrong. I think it's divisive and disrespectful of another.
She told us a wonderful story about the two of you, which was that there was an episode in which something with a boat, and you, Dobie ends up proposing to Zelda, and she turns it down. And if you remember this, or if you know where I'm going with this, and basically, she wanted to play it straight. You wanted to play it for laughs. Do you remember that?
No, I don't. Was that in a Dobie episode?
It was a Dobie episode, and apparently, and as she tells it, by the end of the episode, you decided to ask her to marry him.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that she played it straight. She goes, I want this is like our first honest moment that we can play. She wanted to play it straight. You wanted to play it for laughter. She said afterward, and she said it became a little disagreement. She said that 10 minutes later you showed up at her dressing room with a dozen roses to apologize for
Yes, I remember now. Yes.
Can you tell me your side of that story?
Well, I was trying to keep it light, afraid of the moments of sincerity and honesty, you know. Although I had always talked to Max Schulman and said what we need in the show is more heart. A warmer show would help us, I think, but they didn't pay much attention. So I think Sheila wanted it to be a warm, honest, sweet moment, and I was doing the old, you know, comedy. Comedy was taking over where it should have been put to one side, and I think I felt bad about that. I really did. Interesting, when we did the Bring Me the Head of Dobie Gillis, she played my wife. We were married. I just love Sheila. So, yeah, I do. That was very sweet. And I was probably very wrong, by the way.
Well, the fact that you brought the roses was huge. But where did you get them from?
Oh, down the street, I'm sure. Down the street.
Amazing. I'm trying to think. What was the atmosphere like on Dobie Gillis?
Dobie Gillis was a nice set to work on. It was a hard set because we did the show in 2-3 days, and today again they take a week. But we had to know what we were doing, and we rehearsed very hard, and it was a long day. And I had the worst part of all because I was in every scene, and I had to learn so much dialogue. In the first year, I had to learn the monologues. I memorized them, and there were several in the show, and they were, you know, that much of a paragraph and single-spaced, and they were hard. So I spent my weekend studying, and then all week long working on the show. The second year, they allowed me to read the monologues off the teleprompter. So I could say, hi, my name's Dobie Gillis, and I'm reading a teleprompter. But anyway, so it really made my life a lot easier, and it made their life better in a way too, because they would get into a show in post-production that needed some work, and they would write a monologue that bridged a gap or helped the show. So they could bring in monologues like every 3 or 4 weeks. They'd bring in maybe 30 monologues, and I'd cut through them. I've cut through, in those days, I could cut through 20, 30 monologues in maybe an hour and a half. And I got used to it, and I got facile with it, and it was much easier for me, and like I say, much easier for the show in many ways, fixing stuff in post-production that doesn't work.
So they got through it, they would just cut a whole bunch of stuff all at once.
But to get back to your question about the set, it was a pleasant set. There was nobody, no mean person, you know, there was nobody like in charge. There was no, quote, star that was in charge, you know, that was being catered to. There was none of that. It was just a bunch of us trying to do it the best we could. The closest thing we ever had to things was Tuesday and I, and we got along, and she brought a lot to the show. And if she was standing here today, I would say, I'm sorry if I was crabby, and she'd probably say, I'm sorry if I was kind of not studying my lines enough. I'm sure she would. I'm sure. You know, it's funny how years go by and kind of heals a lot of things.
It's like going back to a high school reunion.
Yeah, although I never do. But I mean, I'm afraid to go. But, well, yeah, high school reunions bring up all kinds of stuff, you know. I mean, whatever happened to so-and-so? And they're either a disappointment or intimidating. I mean, who knows where kids are going, you know. Anyway, that's personal. That's an aside.
Well, that's a good aside. Everybody's got the story that they dined out on. You know, the funny, weird, you can't believe what happened at work today story. Was there one like that stood out for Dobie Gillis?
Not really. Dobie was, you know, one of the old silent people, like a Harold Lloyd. He said, our comedies are not to be laughed at. And making comedies very serious business. I don't remember any big. I think there were funny things all along the way. For example, Warren Beatty, who people didn't seem to take to. I mean, he kept himself aloof. And Bob Denver and a couple other people, I was doing a scene, locked him in his dressing room. And it was one of those dressing rooms which was material on the side, you know, knock up, knock down, whatever you call them. And they turned the thing and he couldn't get out. So instead of, this is typical, you know, we're doing a scene, it's quiet on the set, and he's trying to get out of this dressing room. So he begins singing at the top of his lungs some operatic aria. And we all, you know, he kills the scene and we all look around and, what's going on? Warren got locked in his dressing room. You know, to this day, I don't think he talks much about Dobie Gillis. I'm told that Dustin Hoffman kids him about it, but I don't know either one. Well, I do know Warren from a long time ago, but I don't know Dustin Hoffman.
That's hysterical.
The interviews are tricky. I saw Bob Dylan the other night on 60 Minutes. It was a rerun. Boy, he's tough. He's tough. First of all, he hadn't done an interview in 20 years for television, and he's so talented and odd. He reminds me of Bob Denver.
The first interview I ever did, I was 20 years old. I interviewed this science fiction guy, okay, and I'm sitting there and I got my index card. What was the first, you know, and I'm asking, and like, I don't want to answer that. What do you think, I don't want to talk about that. I went through all 20 of my cards, and like everyone, I'm getting a little bit more frustrated because I don't want to talk about this.
Well, it's really hard because, you know, as a person being interviewed, you never know when the person interviewing you is going to go into an area that's uncomfortable or you don't want to talk about, you know?
Well, he was just sort of like, I threw up the cards in the air. He goes, okay, now you're ready to interview me.
Did it turn out?
Well, it turned out great because he just wanted to have a conversation. And so since then, I've never brought questions to an interview.
Well, whatever you're doing, it works.
Well, I'm glad it does. It's hard because I'm not Barbara Walters, so you don't come in trusting me to begin with.
Well, I would now. I would now.
Thank you. Let's talk. When you're sort of an icon, when you create an icon like Dobie Gillis and you become known with that, it's got its ups and its downs.
Very definitely. The problem is that a success like Dobie Gillis, where you're the title role, so identifies you with that character, which can be, you know, good and bad. It's good at the time because it makes the show a hit and it gives you a success. But on the other hand, if you want to go out afterwards and try and get other jobs, which I did, it was a problem because people would say, well, he's so identified with Dobie Gillis, all people are going to think about is Dobie Gillis and this and that. Not only was that a problem that I was identified with Dobie Gillis, but the character Dobie Gillis was so squeaky clean 50s. And in the 60s, the country was going through a turmoil, Vietnam Wars and all this and that. And the parts were going to guys like Jack Nicholson. And I was so kind of white bread and you know, Pat Boonish. Pat went through the same thing. That it was very difficult to get parts. And that's why I did some beach party movies and I did a lot of other things and then eventually went looking for some other kind of thing because I was discouraged with the lack of acceptance of me. And also being Dobie Gillis then is not like being Dobie Gillis now, because now I've, you know, had a whole life and I have, you know, like I'm an artist. I am in galleries all around the country. I've got galleries in New York and New Jersey and Virginia and so forth, and shows and so I've got other things, and but the idea of being Dobie Gillis became respectable. I became an icon, but a couple of years after the show, you're not an icon. You're just Dobie Gillis and you're identified with that show. And then there was also a stigma attached to being a star of a television show. And I never understood that because, you know, Clint Eastwood was in Rawhide, and pardon me, Clint Eastwood was in Rawhide, and a lot of people, Steve McQueen was Wanted Dead or Alive, you know, everybody, and they went on to movies and did very well. Burt Reynolds, same thing, and Jim Garner was in Maverick, and he became a big movie star and has done very well. So I could never quite understand why there was a stigma attached to being the star of a television show.
But you've gotten to meet some amazing people over the years, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Some people you've met.
Well, I met, you know, Richard Nixon. at the White House, and he said that he and his family loved watching Dobie Gillis. And I was very flattered. Then years later, I met Bill Clinton, Governor Clinton at the time, and he said, "I know you. You're Dobie Gillis. I grew up with you, you know." So that's a span of time there from Nixon to Clinton. So I've been a lot of people and been a lot of places, you know.
Well, Dobie Gillis was off the air for a long time. Shows sort of coming down, and all of a sudden, sort of this nicotine sort of rebirthing of a lot of the shows. What happened when that sort of started coming back again? Did people started recognize? I mean, you're not the teenage Dobie
well,
anymore.
Yeah, and even though I've gotten a lot older, I still kind of seem like Dobie Gillis. I mean, I didn't gain an enormous amount of weight, or I don't look entirely different. I look somewhat like I looked, even though much older. I'm not trying to say how young I look, but what I mean is that I sort of was like Dobie, and if you put on an old Dobie and me, you can see the resemblance, and people would begin again to say, "Hey, you're Dobie Gillis," or "Hi, Dobie," or whatever,
Let's talk about how you got the job working for CBS, as a CBS executive, because sort of now it's like, okay, well, I did this, and then I did this for a while, but that just doesn't just happen.
No, I decided, it was about 1977, and I had come back from Las Vegas, where I was booking entertainment, and I was in 72, and I had done dinner theater, and I wasn't seeing my career going anywhere. I wasn't getting those roles. Being Dobie Gillis didn't mean much at that time. So I thought, why don't I go behind the scenes and learn producing and how to put together shows and movies and things like that, and I can be getting a steady paycheck, and I'll be growing in the entertainment business. So I went to Bill Self, who was head of the West Coast for CBS, and I had known Bill from Fox when I was doing Dobie, and he said there might be a place for me, and so I went and solicited the job. Came up with a resume and the whole bit, and I waited about 6, 8, 9 months, and they hired me in the spring of 77. And I was very glad to be hired, and I was excited about the possibilities of it. But once I got into it, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. But it was still nice to be, employed and getting that salary. It was very nice, and I was learning a lot. I was learning how much I knew and didn't realize I knew when I was an actor. And it was kind of strange for me. It was a difficult period. It really was. But I liked it. I liked it for a long time, and I had to learn to keep my mouth shut a lot of the times, because I would get myself into trouble by saying the wrong thing. In network meetings and things, you got to be careful. In other words, I became a suit, and suits have a way of handling themselves very different than an actor. I mean, I, as an actor, as whatever I am, can say anything I want to do. I can say anything I want to say. I can do what I want to do. But when you're working in a big monolithic corporation, you got to be careful that you don't rub people the wrong way.
All right, what'd you say?
What did Hickman do now that got us into this mess? I remember they were preempting shows. One of the shows was Good Times, and they'd take it off, and they took it off 2 weeks in a row. And I was curious. The next time it went on, the ratings were much worse than they'd been. So I drew up a little chart. When it was on, the 2 weeks it was off. And when it went back on, how it was lower than it had been before it was taken off for 2 weeks. I went and showed my little graph to Bud Grant, who was the head of programming. And he looked at that and thought, I can't believe that, In other words, Bud should have known, and I suddenly found myself starting up something I wish I hadn't, But when you take even a hit and preempt it, it will hurt it the next week. Even a hit. So one of the keys, like WKRP in Cincinnati I worked on, and that show was moved around the schedule like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. It was moved. And it really did hurt the show. Hugh Wilson, the creator producer, told me it had hurt the show, and Harvey Shepard, who was head of programming and so forth, didn't like him, and they'd moved the show and all that. And I always said, it won't hurt, it won't hurt, it won't hurt. I was trying to placate Hugh Wilson, at the same time not get into it with Harvey and the people I worked for. But it did hurt the show. It did hurt the show, and I can see where Hugh Wilson's coming from at the time.
Why would somebody, you got a network, you want to get your ratings up, why would you do something to sabotage a show?
Well, they don't see it that way. You know, that was the frustrations I had at CBS. They don't always see it in terms of hurting a show or helping a show. They have an overall plan that's much, maybe, that I never knew about. But it was a plan and a way of doing things. It's like the government. You know, it's like the United States government. These giant corporations work in strange ways, and I don't know. I can't answer that. Having worked there for 10 years, a lot of their decisions are strange. It's like the actor I told about that wasn't right for the part, and he got the part, about scripts that are, like I was in comedy development for a while, and a guy would come in, a writer would come in, and he'd say, I want to do this show, da-da-da-da-da, and we'd say, okay, go write a script. And he'd write a script, send it in, and it was good. Maybe it needed a little tweaking, but it was good. Well, the guy I worked for, he would, we'd have a meeting, and he would tell the writer, here's what you might think about doing, taking the end and putting it toward the middle, and putting the middle toward the end, and da-da-da-da-da, and the writer would sit there, and he'd go away, and a few weeks later, you'd get the script, and it was terrible. And networks have a tendency to do that. And that's what I said, one of the problems with sitcoms today is there's too many people working on them. You need to get one really good writer that you respect his talent, and if you don't respect, don't get him. But if you respect him, then I'll tell you a show that I think is kind of what I'm talking about is that Desperate Housewives. I think that show has got a point of view, and it does what it does. You may like it or not like it, but I think his name is Mark Cherry. The producer.
Mark Cherry, yeah.
I hope they leave him alone. I hope they leave Mark Cherry alone to do that show. I don't mean that I love it so much, but that's the way a show ought to be. It's his vision of what he wants it to be, and leave him alone and let him do it. And there's so little of that on television today that many times things that could be hits don't become hits because they become derivative and much like other shows and kind of camels.
I think there's like a real sort of, I think you're right. There are certain shows that are that way, but also I would actually make a case for saying that there are certain shows like David Kelly shows, Mark Cherry shows,
yes,
almost anything by Joss Whedon, which is a different genre. But there are certain writers or creators who seem to get that privilege.
But they get it because of who they are. In other words, you have to fight your way up to getting where you are, and then they'll leave you alone. Like Norman Lear was that way. In other words, I couldn't go to Norman Lear when I worked on Maude, which was just a class show. I mean, it was so well put together. Maude, Good Times, All in the Family. You can't go to Norman Lear at the time and give him notes about what it ought to be because he'd tell you to get out. Because he was doing CBS a favor by putting his shows on CBS instead of CBS doing Norman a favor. It was kind of switched. And these people you mentioned, these writers, they have earned that and they have gotten to that position, and that's why their shows are better, because they're left to do their shows without a lot of little picky interference.
Right, great. You were at CBS, so the years you were at CBS, 77 through
87.
So that was kind of an interesting period, especially when you think, 77, you had ABC, CBS had just sort of come out of being number one forever, and now ABC's number one, and then NBC was number one. What was it like during that period?
When we weren't number one anymore?
All of a sudden, they went from being Tiffany number one to like not so much.
That was, of course, Bill Paley's thing, that the CBS was the Tiffany of networks. I mean, it was the best network and all. And they had many years of being number one. And like everything in life, things change. Rod Amato, who did Dobie with me, he said, I have a theory that there's a god of networks. And the god moves every few years to another network. And then when he gets tired of that, that god moves back to another network. And everybody has their run at being number one. Now, that's not a very scientific analysis, but Rod was kind of a funny guy, and that's what he said. I don't know. It was kind of hard because we at CBS weren't used to being number 2 and 3. we wanted to be, and Mr. Paley would come from the Bahamas where he was resting and have meetings, and they did everything. Finally, they started selling the company, which was the worst thing, you know. I mean, it got sold and stuff, but it was not easy. It made everybody very nervous.
Plus, it was also, you were there during the early 80s when sort of cable started coming up. What was the reaction as in, you know, in the network?
You know, I never heard much about cable at the network. It was almost like it didn't exist. And in fact, in my mind, it hardly existed because most of us didn't have it yet. I mean, nobody imagined that cable would become what it is today. I mean, I don't, now that's 20, 30 years ago. Cable was just beginning, and I think it's like everything else, you know, the horse and buggy days, you know. They have cars now, don't pay any attention to it, they'll go away. I think everybody thought cable will go away, not a problem. Don't worry about it, let's just develop new comedies. I mean, the comedy has been in terrible difficulty for the last few years, the half-hour comedy. It's a shame, but they're not as good as they ought to be. But also, we have this reality show thing, which is going to run its course, and a few maybe will last, and most will go off, and then something else will come along. And back to Desperate Housewives, I think that that's a good sign that there's a place for real actors and shows doing something a little different, you know? So, who knows? I think that it'll just change around till it finds itself and it'll come back.
Did you ever get a bad reaction to giving someone a note? I know you didn't give a lot of notes, but what kind of reactions did you give when you gave, you know?
I got pretty good reactions because I was very careful in how I gave them. You know, I mean, I was very diplomatic, and I was always very supportive of the show, so they knew what I was going to say or come up with was not negative, and I would even preface what I had to say by saying, the people I work for feel very strongly about this, and I just want you to know that it isn't necessarily my opinion, but the people I report to at CBS would like it to be this, you know.
Tough position to be in.
It's a very difficult position. It is. It is.
Did they appreciate that to the extent that they could?
The producers, I always got along very well with the producers. I always did, yeah.
I'm sure Which Schwartz, who I had the privilege of interviewing a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I like Sherwood.
That he, when he was working on My Favorite Martian, he got a note from a network executive on one of his scripts. Basically said, a Martian wouldn't say something like this.
Yeah, right.
Like,
That's a great line, and I've heard that line, yeah. Martians don't talk like this. But, you know, you live with it. I mean, he knew what he was dealing with. I tried not to be like that guy, see. I tried not to give a note like Martians wouldn't talk like this. I would say, as a Martian, maybe he would have a different way to be. You know what I mean? But notice the hedging. Maybe, as a Martian, he would maybe have some other way of behaving himself or communicating.
Well, in show business anyway, you're dealing with people with very strong, I hesitate to use the word egos, but sometimes egos are...
No, they do. It takes a strong ego many times. It takes a strong ego to get the job done. Mm-hmm. And no, I think ego is not necessarily that bad a thing, unless it's cruel and unkind, you know. Then it becomes sort of hard to live with. But I think you have to have confidence in yourself, and sometimes it looks like ego, and sometimes the people that have it are right, and they just are strong in expressing themselves. So it's kind of touchy, you know.
When you think back on the Dobie Gillis days, is there a moment that, when you think about, you know, what's the moment that you sort of go back to? Is there a moment? I know there's probably billions of memories.
I always liked the monologues. And I always go back to thinking of me sitting there, that first monologue, and telling what my purpose in life was, to find this one round, creamy, dreamy girl for my very own. That to me, there was a sweetness to Dobie. And I always liked that part of the show. I always liked the part where he was nice. And that's what I meant when I said we need more warmth. We need more. And the relationship I had with Maynard was very, you know, work. Was very, Maynard, go home and feed your iguana. He don't need me, Dobe. He can open the refrigerator door himself. Or, you know, all the lines that come at work. But anyway, the sweetness between these two guys, friendship, you know, that's the quality that I think was very special in Dobie Gillis, because Max tended to write kind of acerbically, and he could be a little rough with his jokes. And I tried to play against that. I tried not to go with the harshness of the joke. And I wanted it to be nice.
How amazing that Bob Denver was able to create a character like Maynard for him, you know, to inhabit that character. And probably the kind of character who becomes so indelibly marked in the audience's mind that that person will never play another character. And then he goes and plays Gilligan.
Well, I think that's amazing, actually. It's a credit to Bob and his talent, because he was almost as strongly identified with Maynard as I was with Dobie. I think he's that talented and has a special quality, and was able to do that. And Sherwood, you know, that was a great show. They had a terrible time keeping that on the air, and then were taken off the air, which was a shame. But I think Bob is a big talent. I think he's, but even more than having the talent, there's a niceness about Bob that works. He was really charming as Gilligan, as he was charming as Maynard. I loved him. It's like Sheila James as Zelda Gilroy. I mean, she was lovely.
I would love to see Maynard meet Gilligan one day. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, yeah. Maynard and Gilligan, you know. He wrote a book, Maynard, Gilligan and Me, I think was the title.
I'm looking through my notes. We've covered a lot of this stuff. Sheila mentioned this little sort of thing that you two had between the two of you.
That? Now cut that out, my Jack Benny. Zelda, please. You know, Zelda, please.
Where did that come
It came out of a bit. We just happened to do it one day, and it was funny. And everybody laughed, and we just kept it in and kept putting it in and putting it back. Zelda, please, you know, and she'd wrinkle her nose at me, you know. It's a cute bit, but it came out of rehearsal. It just flowed, and it became a routine, and it was funny. It really was.
It was a really different time when you were doing Dobie. It was the 60s. Hadn't quite hit yet. You know, the Beatles hadn't hit yet, the Kennedy thing. I mean, you guys were of a certain era. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Dobie, the sweetness, and I use these words, warmth and sweetness, of Dobie really worked because the times were, you know, the 50s. It really was a 50s show, even though it went on in 59 and ran into 63. It was a 50s show. Everybody, you know, it was white buck shoes and check shirts and button-down collars and all that kind of stuff. I'm still wearing all these years later. I think I wore this on Dobie. And it represented a time. And a lot of what Dobie was kind of went out of style, and that's a shame. It became, you know, like you say, the assassination of President Kennedy, the war in Vietnam, a lot of things happened that made our country different. And this kind of sweetness and simplicity and warmth that you had in a Dobie Gillis kind of show was kind of out of style. And that's why the shows became a little harder edged and a little, for example, Norman Lear's shows, they were harder edged, and Archie Bunker was a hard character.
Hard to believe it's only a 7-year difference between the two.
Yeah, but I think I think television and the movies too, but mostly television reflects the times very quickly. The change in times and the change in social attitudes about things, you know, and I think that that's what happened. But Dobie is a special locked-in-time kind of show that is very nice. Leave It to Beaver was kind of that way. Father Knows Best. Many of those shows were 50s shows. You know, it was the Eisenhower years, and everybody was kind of happy, and we weren't at war. We were over a big war, and it was a nice period in this country.
Last episode of Dobie.
You know, I don't remember the last episode because we ended the season like it was going to go on. And then, and many shows do this. They don't have a final episode. And I don't even remember what show it was, but the show was dropped or canceled after we had broken up after that last show. So we had done the season, and it was a few weeks went by, and then I got the word. And I was very sad to hear that it was over.
Now, I read somewhere that the last episode, though, Dobie and Maynard joined the Army. Is that?
No, I don't think that's true. We had an Army thing. We went into the Army in the second or third year, but we went into the Army in the body of the show. And that was to get us out of high school and into a transition, because we were both getting older. And we did about 9-10 episodes in the Army, and they were fun episodes. They were good episodes. I mean, we were just the same people, but dressed in khakis and, in training and all that. We did some very funny shows.
It was a different period back then in terms of, now they do 22 shows a season. How many shows a season did you guys do?
Well, we did, the first season we did 39 shows, and then 36, and 36. We did 147 episodes. And it was a hard go. I mean, it was a lot of shows. I mean, they complain today how tired they are, and they do 22, and we did another, 14, at least 14 more. And we took very few hiatuses. We'd go straight through week after week after week after week. And like I say, with the kind of part I had to know every page, because I was on every page, and I had help with the monologues because they were on the teleprompter. But it was a lot of hard work. But I mean, it was special.
Did you keep any memorabilia from the show?
I would take my script cover, open it, and throw the script in the trash in my room, put a new script in. I kept a few things. Max gave me a thinker statue. I kept that. I have very few. I go to these shows, where memorabilia are sold, and I see all kinds of things I didn't have. And there are people that know the name of the high school, the name of this, the name of that, people that collect that stuff. And they know more about the show than I do.
What is Dobie doing today?
Dobie, that's a good question. The simple, easy answer would be he lives in a small town and runs a market, grocery store, but I don't know. I think he's a poet. I think, he was a kid that could have become anything. And maybe he was kind of an artist, a writer. He wrote poems, for example. He wrote Thalia poem. Thalia, how I love you, I'll never fail you, Thalia. And I know that sounds silly, but he wanted to be able to be a poet. And maybe he would have become a writer and an artist of sorts and a painter. I'm describing myself. That's frightening. That's frightening. I'm sitting here telling you what Dobie would have become, and he's become me. That'll be the ultimate madness when I meld in the Dobie and there's no me anymore and no Dobie. There's just this. Scary. But I still think he would have become a writer and a poet and maybe a painter.
You worked with Lassie.
Yes, on The Sun Comes Up with Jeanette MacDonald. I played her son, and Claude Jarman Jr. had the big part. I was killed running across the street chasing the dog in the first 10 minutes. She was a concert, she was a soprano, a singer, opera singer. And I'm clapping for her in the wings, and we walk across the street, and the dog jumps out of the car, and I run to the dog, and a truck hits me. Great way to start a movie. So I was taken out there in the first 10 minutes, and she's distraught and broken down, and she goes away to rest and meets this boy on the farm who loves Lassie, and very sad.
Oh, so you never actually met Lassie? You were just...
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you met Lassie?
Yeah, I met Lassie. In fact, I worked out with Lassie. They kind of train you a little bit with the dog, so you get used to the dog, and the dog most of all gets used to you. There are several Lassies. There were like 4 or 5 dogs. They all look the same. That way, if one gets tired or won't do it, you bring in another Lassie.
Stunt Lassie.
A stunt Lassie. And also, I've worked in shows with animals where one animal can do one thing with its paw, and then another animal can do this, and pretty soon you mix them up, and you think that one animal can do everything, but they usually can't. They train them for one thing, and then they switch dogs.
We have a few seconds left. Tell me about the theme song.
Dobie. That was written by Max Schulman and Lionel Newman at Fox. And I never thought it was a great song, but it's it certainly is identifiable with the show. And people still sing it. Linda Bloodworth, who created Designing Women, every time she'd see me, she'd sing, "Dobie wants a gal dreaming, Dobie," and I'd be so mortified. But see, again, I was working for CBS, and I got along very well with the Thomasons, and in fact, they let me direct the show. I directed several episodes, and it was sweet. It was nice. You know?
Nice to be remembered for that.
Yeah, yeah.
And still have a great life.
Yeah, yeah, and it's best of all now because it doesn't hurt me any, the Dobie thing, and I have other things I do. You know, I can still act occasionally, or I can do my art. I've got pictures at home You're not supposed to call them pictures, by the way. Paintings. I call them pictures because to me they're pictures, but I get corrected by art people. Is that nuts?
It's all good.
It's all good. It's a picture. You put it on the wall, but technically they're paintings.
I understand. Dwayne, thank you so much. This was really fun and a
My
privilege
pleasure.
for me.
My pleasure.